Empathy has come into medicine as the latest treatment to heal the suffering medical student. Action has even been taken to incorporate it in medical education. I kind of just went through a leadership session talking about it today. But what is empathy? So, hello everybody. This is Elijah, head of your CMC. Happy Philosophy Friday. I want to talk about the philosophical approach to empathy, especially in the context of medical school, which I'm currently in. Um, if you notice, this slide deck is kind of whimsical, but that's because I searched up a presentation using the key term empathy. And actually, if you see these bullet points, I forgot to remove them, but they actually show what the presenter prior wanted to talk about. But I want to start first talking about the very OG philosopher himself, uh, Socrates, at least through the eyes of Plato. So here we are, just a little philosophy before we get to the medicine. Um, this is the Meno, a dialogue by Plato, with his characters being Meno and Socrates. Um, just for a big picture, this is I'm just sharing a short discussion or presenting excerpts from this as a way for you to think about how we can start talking philosophically about empathy, for one, and two, if we can apply some of these um, discussions that happened 2,000 years ago into current um, debates on empathy or, well, moving forward, just medical concepts, because a lot of concepts in medicine are highly philosophical and we just don't realize it. So let's start the very first line. Meno, can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? Or if neither, by teaching nor practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way? We'll skip ahead a bit, but if you're familiar with Socrates, he really goes to town in terms of asking Meno, what does he mean about virtue, and where does it apply to? And he thinks of counterexamples and all. But we get to this crux in which Socrates says, and does this definition of virtue include all virtue? Is virtue the same in a child and a slave? Can the child govern his father or the slave his master? And would he who governed be any longer a slave? Advice. I think not, Socrates. A lot of Socrates' interlocutors end up just saying that I think not, or certainly Socrates. Um, so it's enjoyable to read it if you think of it as a play, because, well, Plato's also a poet. So, but, well, let's continue. And then let's see if we can find the point. Just a small checkpoint. We are once again talking about empathy, but I'm using these excerpts from Meno to demonstrate some philosophical principles. So we try to hit two birds with one stone. So if just to note this, Socrates, as let's say as the philosopher, asks, by virtue, what do you mean by virtue? Does it apply to the slave boy, to the son? Is it the same in all things? Basically, leaving no stone unturned. The rest of the dialogue is extremely fascinating, and it's actually a huge foundation of a lot of philosophical thought that came thousands of years later. So we still talk about it because, well, I hope to show you why. So continuing a couple of pages down, Socrates says, "For as all nature is akin, and the soul has learned all things, there is no difficulty in her eliciting, or as men say, learning, out of a single recollection. For all enquiry and all learning is but recollection. And therefore we ought not to listen to this sophistical argument about the impossibility of inquiry, for it will make us idle, and is sweet only to the sluggard. But the other saying will make us active and inquisitive, in that confiding I will gladly inquire with you into the nature of virtue." You can see Meno's picture here. He says, "Yes, Socrates, but what do you mean by saying that we do not learn, and that we call learning is only a process of recollection? Can you teach me how this is?" We don't skip this time here. Let's continue. Socrates says, "I told you, Meno, just now that you were a rogue, and now you ask me whether I can teach you? When I'm saying that there's no teaching but only recollection, unless you imagine that you will involve me in a contradiction." And Meno replies, "Indeed, Socrates, I protest that I had no such intention. I only asked the question from habit, but if you can prove to me what you say is true, I wish that you would." I don't know about you guys, but that exchange is pretty funny. um, Philosophy is thought to be comedy in many ways. I guess this one is just a basic one. It's just funny, but it demonstrates a principle in philosophical thought. We don't like contradictions. We leave no stone unturned, um, and we get very meticulous. Right? Some people sometimes think in Tagalog they call you philosopher if you keep asking too many questions. Medicine could sometimes think about it, think like that, or criticize philosophy for that. But um, there's need for theory in that it grounds the practical aspects. There's that relationship that philosophy has with all the sciences, especially medicine. Medicine is fascinating, as we saw in the previous video about what medical ethics, actually, the medical perspective has to do with ethics. But I digress. So here we are in this new slide. We're talking about the Meno. Um, After the point in which we talked about in the last slide, to this point, Socrates brought out a slave boy of Minos, and he asked him, the slave boy, a couple of questions regarding geometry. Obviously, he didn't know, but he asked it in what they call the Socratic method, which law students know quite, I guess, with some pain in recollecting the experience. Um, but he would ask questions about, the sides of a triangle or the sides of a square or whatnot. And if you do this and you do that, and the boy, from watching the dialogue unfold, which is interesting to watch, he demonstrated, or at least Socrates demonstrated to Meno that even though he doesn't explicitly know this, it doesn't it seem like recollection? Learning is just recollection, and the question is, can you really be taught anything? So, and so Socrates here at this point he comments, but if he always possessed this knowledge, he would always have known, or if he has acquired the knowledge, he could not have acquired it in this life, unless he's been taught geometry. For he may to do the same with all geometry and every other branch of knowledge. Now, has anyone ever taught him all this? You must know about him, as you say, he was born and bred in your house. And Meno replies, and I'm certain that no one ever did teach. This picture is great. So Socrates says, and yet he has the knowledge. And then Meno's like, the fact, Socrates, is undeniable. Again, another witty quip. But continuing on, again, skipping a couple of parts, again, excerpts. Meno says, true, but do you think that there are no teachers of virtue? And Socrates says, I've certainly often inquired whether there were any, and taken great pains to find them. I've never succeeded, and many have assisted me in the search. And there were the persons whom I thought the most likely to know. And these are the sort of men from whom you are likely to learn whether there are any teachers of virtue and who they are. If we wanted Meno to be a good physician, to whom should we send him? Should we not send him to the physicians? Yes, there's a reason why I put this in. It's like a big shout out, you know. Physicians, medicine was there even since the start of Western civilization. But just to follow the story so far, which is very exerted, and I think we're going to stop here just so we can move on to empathy. But virtue, the question at this point is, can it be learned or is it taught? So, again, similar to our question, can empathy be taught in medical education? So, let's continue. Socrates says, to sum up our inquiry, the result seems to be, if we are at all right in our view, that virtue is neither natural nor acquired, but an instinct given by God to the virtuous. That is excellent, Socrates. Socrates. Then, Meno, the conclusion is that virtue comes to the virtuous by the gift of God. But we shall never know the certain truth until, before asking how virtue is given, we inquire into the actual nature of virtue. And that's the end of the scene, or the dialogue. And again, this isn't to summarize the Meno for you, but to demonstrate parts of it that demonstrate philosophical thought and a scaffolding that we can approach to the question that we're trying to ask here. Can empathy be taught in medical education? So now again to the meat of it, we go once again. Empathy in medical education, can it be taught? Um, I'm going to get some of this from my own paper that I wrote, whether empathy can be taught in medicine. So, as we said in this first slide earlier, before we talked about Plato, um, empathy's come into medicine. They're trying to teach it, but implementation of this from the proponents of the medical field has received much pushback from their colleagues. They oppose the conception as unnecessary and superfluous at best, obstructive, and antithetical at first. Publication from the Journal of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh released a joint article juxtaposing two perspectives of whether empathy can be taught in medicine. The affirmative, in this slide, has argued that it is quite possible to do so, but only with a multifaceted approach. Just summarize, and I put it here in the slide. 1. Clarify the concept of empathy. 2. Teach perspective, taking curiosity and reflection. 3. Teach empathic behavior. 4. Teach ethics. 5. Explore the limits of empathy. 6. Support and empathize with students and doctors. 7. Change the medical culture. Very bold. Again in the same paper, this time by Robert Downey. Not Junior, just Robert Downey. The negatives argue that not only is it philosophically impossible to do so, it is highly inappropriate to even attempt to do so in the medical setting. Just read a bit of my paper, but so if you think about it, what's empathy? What's the big deal? In my leadership course or class module, whatever, we talked about empathy, and I think if I remember correctly, Oxford says it's the act of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and in the leadership, we actually had to exchange shoes with somebody and walk in them. But you can see there are pros and cons here. Is empathy even possible to be taught that at all? You saw in the positive, the first one was clarify the concept of empathy, because he probably is aware. What the heck is empathy? Is it even possible? And the negative here, Robert Downey, he says it's impossible. You can't put yourself in another person's perspective. And the second part, if it is possible, it would be inappropriate to the medical setting. Isn't that violating the person's rights? You're seeing things from their perspective. So I'd like to present one perspective that I found useful in my own research about this and thinking about it in terms of whether empathy can be taught in medicine. This is from the perspective of Edith Stein. She's a Jewish philosopher that later in her life turned uh, to be a Catholic Carmelite nun specifically, but she was initially a student and eventual philosopher in her own right that collated Edmund Husserl in his works. Husserl was the founder of the School of Phenomenology, and for the people who in my school who talk about phenomenology, this is a different phenomenology. We sometimes butt heads with the people who use phenomenology in psychology versus phenomenology per se, where we kind of see ourselves as the OG. um, but anyway, Edith Stein here is kind of the OG because she wrote under Husserl as her advisor. She wrote on the topic of the problem of empathy. Her other famous writing is called Essays on Women. So she's a very inspirational writer and philosopher. So, as I said earlier, Edith Stein has a doctoral thesis called On the Problem of Empathy. And just like Plato's Meno, the dialogue, I don't profess to summarize it or even be capable of it, but just to share some key insights to help us start thinking about these concepts a bit more. Um, Not just because it's interesting, but I think it could be useful in medical education. I'm being a bit facetious here about the conclusion of whether empathy can be taught in medicine or not. But so key insights that she said. Again, she's using the phenomenological method, but not in the way that you know it, because well, she's not interviewing somebody for some reason, but she's deriving from her experience of empathy and describing it in as much detail as possible. So one of the key insights that I think that she said is that empathy can be mistaken with memory or imagination. For example, she actually uses this example. You have a doctor and he is examining a patient with a withering hand, right? There's a point in which you're, again, medical students, right? We're like looking at their scars, striations, blah blah blah. Um, but if you are looking at the withered hand as a medical student, you'd think about, yeah, right, the scars, striations, um, if there's any clubbing of the fingernails or whatever, um, you know, edema or whatnot. You are using memory or imagination. You're trying to remember the case from before, or you're imagining. Um, but are you empathizing, right? Um, and that empathy is a loaded word, right? Because it's demonstrated very differently. But the way that Stein approaches it is that um, empathy can be mistaken with memory imagination, which goes to her second point. Nevertheless, empathy has the same structure. And the subpoint here says it involves an experience that is primordial in experience, but with content that is non primordial. So, just a short breakdown, primordial just means like original or like native to the person. So, an experience that is primordial, as in like you're the one experiencing it, but the content, as in like the withered hand that you're imagining, is non primordial, i.e., it is not coming from you. Um, so, what she means by that it has the same structure is that empathy involves encountering the other person's consciousness and observing it. So if you look at somebody and you empathize, you intuit what they're feeling. That's empathy. That's simply what empathy is. And this leads to her kind of important statement. She says, empathy is a kind of act of perceiving sui generis. What that means in layman's term is empathy is intuitive. It is something that you just have. It's something that you just do. So I was talking about the withered hand. If you, in inspecting the wooden hand, get into it, what the other person is feeling, it's empathy. It's not. I forgot the name of the video that we watched about empathy. She is basically trying to ground empathy in a very specific and detailed way. That it isn't simply a kind of vulnerability. Empathy is actually literally just intuiting what the other person is of saying. And it says, I keep saying intuiting, but she uses here perceiving. So it's a kind of perception that we have. She uses this to clarify that when we make ourselves vulnerable, for example, and show a good kind of empathy, we can may as well call that compassion. And other people talk about sympathy as being like you're from a higher point and you're saying, "Oh, that's too bad that you have your withered hand. At least your other hand isn't withered." Like, so that's not exactly what Stein is trying to say. Stein is saying that regardless of whether or not you are demonstrating compassion or what they call sympathy, that's just tantamount to empathy. And why is this important for medicine? It's important because empathy is actively being taught in medical institutions, especially mine today. It's being taught and debated in the literature and whether or not it's useful because they'd say that teaching empathy would reduce physician burnout, managing that, and would improve patient outcomes because the patients would think they're receiving better care because the physician allegedly that is taught how to be empathetical is the patient gets to understand what they're feeling. But that goes to the question, the fundamental question in the deeper side is, can empathy even be taught? That's the whole crux of it. And it's also why philosophy or philosophical reflection on these concepts are important, because what if it can't be taught, right? What if empathy is impossible, as the negative approach took? Um, but the perspective I gave with Edith Stein is that um, it's kind of like a mean between the extreme approach, in that empathy is perception of another person's um, consciousness or their experience of the world. We can get it wrong and we can get it right. Um, and the simplicity of that definition makes it easier for us to understand whether or not it can be taught. Because if we take this understanding, then we know that, just like in the Meno, you can, they ask, can virtue be taught? Or is it something learned? And basically Socrates' conclusion there was that it's something innate. It's just a gift from God. And if we minus the, I guess, philosophical deism or religious overt undertones that might be more um, touchy in this modern day and age, you can just think about it. What Edith Stein says in terms of perception, that we're able to that in empathy we access. It's something that we can't help because it's something innate. Because she talks empathy is how a person becomes more of himself. And so the context of the concepts that underlie and underpin these discussions in terms of medicine is also important for formation, right? So, in my school, they tried to talk about the empathy in the less specific sense of terms of being vulnerable. It's like a specific. They try to label empathy as a specific kind of vulnerability. Well, not they. I mean, like they base it on Wiseman's understanding of empathy, for example, sitting in another person's shoes and whatnot, as a framework, right? And they test out the framework. Very scientific in that sense, um, but that whole program is integrated with this idea of cura personalis, because my medical school is a Jesuit school, for example. So care for the whole person, and so the intention is there, but there's also a way, I think, that we can get a bit more clarity on this. And so if we try to answer the question of whether or not empathy can be taught in medicine, it's a yes and a no, very Jesuit, or very Catholic, or not, at both ends. Because in one way, you can teach a person the concept of empathy. I guess if you subscribe to Stein's approach, that it's a kind of perception, and that it's something that you can't really turn off. You can try to, and I guess in many ways you can try to deny God's existence, right? For example, but you can't really. It's part of being human to have this awareness of the other person. Uh, Aristotle said that man is a political animal, right? And so the negative earlier that Downey was talking about in terms of um, it's impossible to empathize another person. It's an interesting opinion, but it's hard to back that up because we live in such an interdigitated, right, society. Um, so we have to think about empathy a bit deeper, I think, whether you accept this definition or not. I hope the philosophical tools of like trying to avoid contradiction, being rigorous and exact and Socratic in terms of asking questions, because as the philosopher Martin Heidegger says, questioning is the piety of thought. Um, it is a good thing, especially for medicine. If you think about it, like the whole medical interview is about asking questions. So I think such a interesting field of philosophy is being sprouted out in the field of medicine that there's, well, I'm just excited. There's so much more to talk about. I'll see you next week. God bless.